I'm Adele Kingsley, 49 years old, and I spent 27 years flying for the United States Air Force. All the way from a brand new lieutenant to the colonel who now commands an entire airlift wing. For most of my life, the people closest to me decided I did not belong on a flight line, the one place I loved most in the world, and I let them, over and over, because the man who taught me that fence was my own father. But the day I arrived to take command, a young sergeant blocked me at the edge of that line and told me to wait in the parking lot, and the next morning he found out exactly who I was. Have you ever been dismissed on sight by people who never bothered to ask who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you are tuning in from. And if you have ever had to quietly stand your ground after a lifetime of being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. It was the summer of 1989, and the most honest place I knew was a strip of hot concrete that smelled like jet fuel and scorched metal. I was 12 years old the first time my father let me stand at the edge of the flight line while he launched a jet. He told me to keep my heels on the yellow line and my hands out of my pockets, and then he walked out into all that noise like it was the only room in the world where he could breathe. My father was a master sergeant then, a crew chief, and he had spent almost 20 years learning the body of an aircraft the way some men learn scripture. He could put his palm flat on a panel and tell you whether the jet was happy. He knew the sound a good engine made and the slightly wrong sound that meant a long night ahead. When the jet he had been working rolled forward and lifted off into the gray evening, he watched it the way other fathers watched their children. And I understood, even at 12, that the flight line was where he kept the best part of himself. On the drive home that night, he said the thing he would say in 100 different ways over the next 30 years. He said a flight line was the only honest piece of ground on any base. Out there, he told me, the jet does not care about your rank or your last name or how good you look in a photograph. Either you keep it flying or you do not. Everything else, he said, was paperwork and politics belonged to people who showed up clean and left clean. I did not know yet that he was describing a fence and that he had already decided which side of it I would always stand on. At the kitchen table, he held court. My father was not a loud man, but he was a certain one, and certainty fills a room more completely than volume ever could. He would talk about the officers who rotated through his squadron, young lieutenants and captains who signed the forms and took the credit, and, in his telling, never once turned a wrench or skinned a knuckle or stood on the ramp at 2 a.m. in freezing rain, coaxing a sick engine back to life. My older sister Bridget, 3 years ahead of me and already fluent in the things adults wanted to hear, would laugh along and ask the right questions, and the two of them would build that fence a little higher together. My mother, Carol, said almost nothing during those talks. She would refill my father's coffee and slide an extra spoonful of potatoes onto my plate. And only years later did I understand that her silence was not agreement. It was the quiet of a woman keeping her own counsel in a house where one voice had already won. She clipped things from the newspaper that no one else noticed. She kept a folder I did not know about until I was grown. I loved the flight line the way you love something you have been told you can only visit. By the time I was 14, I could name every aircraft on the ramp by the shape of its tail. By 16, I was reading my father's old technical manuals at the kitchen table, not because anyone asked me to, but because they were the closest thing I had to a map of his heart. In the spring of 1994, when I was 17, he taught me to use a torque wrench in the garage. It was the closest the two of us ever got. He stood behind me and put his hand over mine and showed me how to feel for the click, how to trust the tool instead of forcing it. How a fastener that is properly set will tell you so if you are quiet enough to listen. For an hour, the fence came down. For an hour, I was not a visitor. Then he wiped his hands on a red shop rag and looked at me with something that was almost pride and almost grief. And he said, "You have got good hands. Do not waste them signing other people's paperwork." He meant it kindly. That was the thing I would spend most of my life trying to explain to people. He was not cruel. He was not trying to wound me. He was handing me the only wisdom he had, which was that the honest work happened on the concrete, and everything above it was a costume. He could not have known that he was teaching me to apologize for wanting more than he had wanted, or that the lesson would take 20 years to wear off. I remember standing in that garage at 17, the smell of motor oil and cut grass coming through the open door, my hands still warm from where his had covered them, and feeling two things at exactly the same time. I felt that I belonged to that flight line in my bones, that it had raised me as surely as my parents had, and I felt, underneath that, a cold and certain knowledge that the only way I would ever get onto it for good was a path my father would never call real. I did not say any of that out loud. In my family, you did not argue with my father's certainty. You stepped back and made room for it, the way you step back from a running engine. So I wiped my own hands on my jeans, and I handed him back the wrench, and I told him I would remember the click. I did remember it. I have remembered it on 4 continents and through 2 wars and across 27 years in a uniform he never quite believed I had earned. I remembered it the day a young sergeant stood in my path at the edge of a flight line, 8,000 kilometers from that garage, and told me, in almost my father's exact words, that I did not belong there. But that morning was still a long way off. That night, I was just a girl who loved an honest piece of ground and who already knew, without having the words for it, that the man who taught her to love it had quietly decided she could only ever stand at its edge. I chose the commission anyway, not to spite him, to reach the thing I loved. In the fall of 1995, I sat my parents down in the living room and told them I had been offered a Reserve Officer Training Corps scholarship, that I was going to college, and that at the end of it, I would be commissioned as an officer in the Air Force. I had practiced the words. I thought foolishly that the scholarship itself, the fact that someone had looked at me and seen something worth investing in, might be enough to move him. My father listened with his arms crossed. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said it was the long way around to a desk. He did not raise his voice. He said it the way he might have noted that rain was coming, as a simple fact about the weather. Bridget, home from her business courses, framed it more sharply. She said almost gently that not everyone could get into the programs they really wanted, and that there was no shame in taking what you could get. She made my acceptance sound like a consolation prize. My mother got up and went to the kitchen. I heard the scissors. I did not know until much later that she cut the scholarship notice out of the base newspaper that week and put it in the folder she had been keeping since I was a child. I spent 4 years in college with a uniform in my closet and a chip on my shoulder I tried very hard not to show. I was good at it. I was good at the academics, good at the leadership exercises, good at the long runs in the dark. And the whole time, underneath, I carried my father's voice telling me that none of it was the honest work, that I was learning to sign forms while real people kept the jets flying. I was commissioned as second lieutenant in the spring of 1999, 22 years old, and I went straight to pilot training. Because if I was going to be an officer, I was going to be one who actually flew, who actually touched the aircraft, who could not be accused of staying clean. Pilot training nearly broke me and then remade me. In the year 2000, I earned my wings. They assigned me to airlift, to the big cargo aircraft that move people and equipment and the wounded across the world, and I was proud of it, down to the soles of my boots. My father came to my winging. I want to be fair to him. He came. He put on a sport coat, and he drove a long way, and he shook my hand. And for a second I let myself believe the fence was finally down. Then a retired friend of his asked what I would be flying, and my father said, with a small shrug, that I was flying the trash haulers. He meant airlift. In his world, the fighters and the bombers were the warriors, and the cargo aircraft were the trucks. And he said it the way he said everything, as a plain fact rather than an insult, which was somehow worse than if he had been trying to hurt me. He came. He even smiled. But he introduced me as the daughter who flew the trash haulers, and he believed he was simply telling the truth. In the year 2001, I called home for my first deployment. I was 24, flying tactical airlift into places I was not allowed to name on an open line. And I called because I wanted my father to know I was out there doing it for real. He spent most of the call asking about the maintenance crews. Were they taking care of my aircraft? Did they have the parts they needed? Was the crew chief any good? The crews were real to him in a way I never quite managed to be. I sat in a plywood phone booth in the desert with the line crackling and answered questions about other people, and when I hung up, I told myself it was just his way of caring, that asking about the jet was the only language of love he had. That same year, I made first lieutenant. 2 years later, in 2003, I made captain and moved to the larger aircraft, the long-haul strategic airlift, the kind that crosses oceans with a cargo bay the size of a house. At a family barbecue that summer, one of my uncles asked me, with real curiosity, what I actually did up there all day. Before I could answer, Bridget said, "Mostly paperwork and autopilot," and laughed, and the table laughed with her, and I let it go. I had become very good at letting it go. I had a whole architecture built around letting it go, a way of nodding and smiling and stepping back that I had been refining since I was 12. My father retired in 2002 as a Chief Master Sergeant, the very top of the enlisted force, a rank that perhaps 1 in 100 ever reaches. He had earned every stripe. 32 years on the line, and he walked away, respected by everyone who had ever worked for him. I was genuinely, uncomplicatedly proud of him. I drove 12 hours to be at his retirement, and I stood in the back and watched grown men line up to thank him, and I clapped until my hands hurt. He never drove 12 hours for anything of mine. I am not saying that to be bitter. I am saying it because it took me most of my life to notice it, and noticing it was the beginning of something. I deployed again. I flew through threats I will not describe to a barbecue audience. In 2008, over a place I still cannot name, I brought a badly damaged aircraft and the people inside it home, and the Air Force gave me a Distinguished Flying Cross for it. When I told my family, my father nodded and said it sounded like I had gotten lucky, and Bridget asked if it came with a raise. My mother asked me to mail her a copy of the citation. I found out years later it went into the folder with everything else. I stood on a tarmac far from home with new ribbons on my chest and understood something that did not make me cry, because I had long since stopped crying about it. The people whose recognition I wanted most were always going to look at me and see a tourist, and I had spent so many years agreeing with them that I had nearly become one in my own mind. 23 years later, I landed at Ramstein Air Base in the south of Germany on a gray afternoon in June of this year, the day before I was scheduled to take command of the airlift wing stationed there. I was 49 years old, I had commanded a squadron and then an operations group. I had been selected, out of a field of officers, any one of whom could have done the job, to lead an entire wing, thousands of airmen and dozens of aircraft, and the mission of moving people and cargo and the wounded across half the world. The orders making it official were folded in the bag on my shoulder. I came in a day early, and I came alone, and I did it on purpose. I declined the staff car that the wing had offered to send. I took a commercial connection and a rental, and I changed out of my uniform into slacks and a plain dark jacket before I left the hotel, because I did not want to arrive as the new commander. I wanted 10 quiet minutes on the flight line as myself, before the ceremony turned me into a symbol, and the salutes started, and everyone began performing around me. I wanted to stand at the edge of the ramp, the way I had stood at 12, and just look at the jets, and feel my father's honest piece of ground under my feet one more time, as a person, rather than a rank. The light was going soft and golden over the aircraft when I walked toward the entry control point. I could see the tails lined up, the big airlifters I had spent my life flying, and something in my chest loosened. I had 3 quiet hours before I had to be anyone in particular. A young sergeant stepped into my path. He was perhaps 28, security forces, sharp and squared away in his uniform, with the particular certainty that young men in uniform sometimes wear like a second set of stripes. He crossed his arms and looked at me, a woman in civilian clothes walking toward a restricted flight line, and he made a decision about who I was in about half a second. I watched him make it. I had been watched that way my whole life. "You can't be here, ma'am," he said. "This is a restricted flight line." I started to reach for my identification. I had it. I had the orders too. 1 card and 1 folded sheet of paper, and the whole thing would have ended right there. "No badge, no access," he said, before I could get the card out. He said it firmly, the way you say a thing you have said 100 times to lost spouses and confused contractors and tourists who wandered off from the visitor center. "Go wait in the parking lot." I held the card halfway out of my bag. I offered quietly to show him my identification. He waved it off. He told me the flight line was not a place for sightseers, that whoever I was looking for could come and meet me on the other side of the fence, and that I needed to step back. He was not rude, exactly. He was certain. He had decided what I was, and nothing I could produce from my bag was going to be as real to him as the decision he had already made. And I stood there in the golden light, looking past him at the aircraft I had loved my entire life, the exact ground I had been raised to worship, being guarded against me by a young man who sounded so much like my father that for one strange second I genuinely lost track of which decade I was standing in. He had my father's certainty. He had my father's fence. He believed all the way down that the line belonged to the people who kept the jets flying, and that a woman who looked like me was, at best, a visitor. I could have ended it with one sentence. "I am Colonel Kingsley. I take command of this wing tomorrow. Step aside." I felt the sentence sitting in my mouth, fully formed, and I felt how good it would feel to say it, and I did not say it. because I had been here before. I had been turned away from this exact piece of ground my whole life. And I had always stepped back, and some old reflex older than my rank took over. He sounded so much like my father that I forgot which decade I was standing in. So I did what I had done my whole life. I stepped back and I said nothing. I thanked him for doing his job. I told him I would wait where he asked, and I turned around and walked back across the apron toward the parking lot, the orders that made every inch of that flight line mine sitting folded in the bag on my shoulder, unopened. I sat in the rental car with the engine off and watched the jets through the chain link fence as the light died. I was not angry at the sergeant. He had done exactly what he had been trained to do. He had guarded the line. The only thing he had gotten wrong was the same thing my whole family had gotten wrong for 49 years, which was deciding on sight who looked like they belonged. I thought about my father in the garage. You have got good hands. Do not waste them signing other people's paperwork. I thought about how many times I had stepped back to make a certain man comfortable. And I sat in that parking lot, a woman about to command everything on the other side of that fence. And I let myself feel, all the way through, how tired I was of being told to wait outside. I did not know it yet, but that young sergeant would be standing in formation in front of me in less than 18 hours. I did not know that the parking lot would come back to him in the worst possible moment, or that what I chose to do in that moment would matter more than anything I had ever put on a performance report. I just knew that I had stepped back one more time, and that I was done. Back in the hotel that night, I hung my service dress uniform on the back of the closet door and stood looking at it in the lamplight. The silver eagles of a full colonel sat on each shoulder, the rank I had spent 27 years climbing toward. An hour earlier, I had been waved off a flight line like a woman who had lost her way to the commissary. The two facts sat in the same small room and refused to reconcile. I am not someone who stews. Flying teaches you to put the emotion in a box, fly the aircraft, and open the box later when you are safely on the ground. I had been opening boxes on the ground my whole career. But that night the box would not close, so I called the one person who has known me since before I had eagles on my shoulders. Tess Marlowe and I went through pilot training together at the turn of the century, two of only a handful of women in our class, and she has been my truest friend for a quarter of a century. She is a major now, and she could have been more if she had wanted the politics, and she has never once in 25 years told me a comfortable lie. When she picked up, I told her the whole thing, the early flight, the plain jacket, the young sergeant, the parking lot. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me one question. She asked why I had not simply shown him my orders. I gave her my reasons. He was doing his job. There was no point embarrassing a young troop. It was not worth the scene. I had a ceremony in the morning, and I did not want to start my command by pulling rank at a gate. Tess let me finish, and then she said the thing no one in my family had ever said to me in 49 years. She said, "You keep stepping back to make room for people who were never going to make room for you." She said I had done it with my father and my sister, and 100 rooms full of people who had decided what I was before I opened my mouth, and that I had gotten so good at it that I had just done it again on the eve of taking command to a stranger young enough to be my son. I sat with that. Out the window, the lights of the base glowed against the low German sky, the flight line somewhere out there in the dark, mine in the morning, whether anyone believed it or not. I thought about the sergeant. Wade, I would learn his name was. 28 years old, certain, guarding that line as if it were his own, which in the way that mattered it was. And I realized that I was not angry at him at all. I recognized him. He was my father at 28. He was, if I was honest, a little bit of me at 28, before the years sanded the certainty off. He had been handed the same fence my father had handed me, and he was standing on it doing exactly what he had been taught, and he had no idea that the woman he had turned away had been on the other side of that fence her entire life. Somewhere in that hotel room, two ideas that I had always kept apart finally came together. For most of my life, I had believed that quiet dignity meant stepping back, that the graceful thing, the strong thing, was to absorb the slight and let the truth sort itself out later, if it ever did. And I had also believed, separately, that standing fully in the truth of who I was would be a kind of arrogance, a betrayal of the humility my father prized. That night, I understood they were not opposites. I could stand all the way up in the truth of what I had earned and still be gracious. I could let the orders be read and the colors be passed and let the truth land on that young sergeant with its full weight, and I could do it without crushing him. Dignity did not require me to keep waiting in parking lots. And the truth, when it finally arrived, did not have to arrive as a weapon. I decided two things before I turned off the lamp. The first was that I would never again step back to make someone comfortable with the lie that I did not belong. The second was that when Wade the sergeant realized who I was, and he would realize in front of the entire wing, I was not going to use that moment to make him small. I was going to use it to teach him something I had needed 49 years to learn myself. Lying there, I let myself count the parking lots. Not the literal one outside the hotel, the figurative ones, the long line of them stretching back through my whole life. The winging ceremony where my father called the aircraft I had earned the trash haulers, and I smiled and let it go. The phone call from the desert where he asked about everyone but me, and I told myself it was love. The barbecue where my sister answered a question about my career with a joke, and I laughed along so no one would feel awkward. The promotion to major that no one from my family attended. The distinguished flying cross that my father said sounded like luck. Every single time I had been handed a small invitation to insist on myself, and every single time I had declined it, stepped back, made room, kept the peace. I had built an entire career on excellence and an entire family life on apology. And I had never once noticed that the two were running on parallel tracks that never touched. Tess was right. I had become so fluent in stepping back that my body did it now without consulting me, the way it had done it at that gate. Automatically before my rank or my orders or 27 years of earning could get a word in. That stopped tonight, not loudly, just completely. I set my alarm. I looked one more time at the eagles glinting on the shoulders of the uniform in the dark. Then I went to sleep, more settled than I had been in a long time. A commander who had finally decided that quiet dignity and standing in the full light of the truth were allowed, at last, to be the same thing. I reported to wing headquarters early the next morning, in uniform this time, an hour before the ceremony, to meet the people who would run the wing with me. The first of them was waiting in the outer office with a cup of coffee she had clearly made for me and a look on her face that told me she already knew. Command Chief Master Sergeant Gloria Tackett had 30 years in the Air Force and the kind of bearing that makes a room straighten up without a word being said. The Command Chief is the senior enlisted leader of the wing, the commander's right hand on everything that touches the enlisted force, and a good one is worth more than any aircraft on the ramp. I could tell within 10 seconds that Gloria Tackett was a very good one. I could also tell, from the careful way she was holding her face, that the story of the night before had already traveled. It had. The enlisted grapevine on any base is faster and more accurate than any official channel. And by 0600 that morning, it had carried the news that a security forces sergeant had turned the incoming wing commander away from the flight line and sent her to wait in the parking lot. Chief Tackett was mortified. She told me so directly, which I respected. She told me that the sergeant in question, Staff Sergeant Wade Brennan, was one of her better young troops, sharp and conscientious, and that she was prepared to pull him from the ceremony formation and deal with him however I wished. She made it clear that whatever I wished would be done. I asked her to leave him exactly where he was. She did not hide her surprise. I do not think she had expected that from a brand new commander with something to prove and a fresh humiliation to avenge. I told her I wanted Brennan in the formation, in the ranks where he was scheduled to be, and I wanted her to say nothing to him beforehand. Not a word of warning. Let the morning unfold the way it was going to unfold. I told her the truth about why. He did his job by the book, I said. He guarded a restricted flight line against someone he could not identify, which is exactly what we train him to do, and exactly what I would want him to do if there were ever a real threat at that gate. The only thing he got wrong, I told her, was deciding on sight who looks like they belong, and I said, I would rather he learn that than fear me. Chief Tackett looked at me for a long moment, and something in her recalibrated. She had spent 30 years watching officers handle moments like this, and most of them, she told me later, handled them badly. The insecure ones made an example. The weak ones pretended it had not happened. She had braced herself for one of those two and gotten neither. She set the coffee down in front of me and said, simply, "Yes, ma'am." And from that moment forward, I knew I had a command chief I could trust with anything. It did not stay that simple, of course. Word had reached others, and a few of them wanted blood. A senior first sergeant, eager to show the new boss that the wing took care of its own discipline, came to me before the ceremony and proposed a list of consequences for Brennan, a counseling statement, a hard conversation, a mark that would follow the young man for a while. He meant well. He thought he was protecting me. I shut it down. I told him there would be no counseling statement, no mark, no example made. I told him that the sergeant had done his duty and that I would not start my command by punishing a young airman for guarding my own flight line a little too well. The first sergeant did not entirely understand, but he saluted and let it go. So there it was. Before Wade Brennan even knew my name, before he had any idea that the woman he had waved off was about to become the most important person on the base, I had already decided to protect him. I had stood at the head of the wing in my mind and chosen mercy over the easy, satisfying thing. Not because he deserved it in some accounting sense, but because I had spent 49 years being judged on sight, and I knew exactly what it cost, and I was not going to hand that cost to a young man simply because I finally had the power to. Chief Tackett walked me toward the ceremony, and on the way she told me something I have carried ever since. She said that in 30 years, she had learned to read a new commander in the first hard decision they made, and that most of them, when they got embarrassed, reached for the biggest hammer in the room to prove it would never happen again. She said the ones worth following reached for the smallest tool that would actually fix the problem. She said she had watched good airmen broken by leaders who confused fear with respect, and that she had been bracing herself, since the moment the parking lot story reached her ears, for one more of those. Then she looked at me sideways, the way a senior enlisted leader looks at an officer she is deciding whether to trust, and she said that what I had chosen told her more about how I would run her wing than any speech I could give from the podium. I told her the truth, which was that I had been on the receiving end of the big hammer my whole life, in a family instead of a unit, and that I knew precisely what it bought, which was silence and distance, and a child who grew up believing she did not belong. I was not going to spend that currency on a 28-year-old who had simply done his job. She nodded once, and from a command chief, one nod is a contract. I straightened my jacket. The eagles sat on my shoulders, earned and heavy. Through the window I could see the formation beginning to assemble out on the ramp, rows of airmen in the early light, and somewhere in those rows a certain sergeant who had no idea what the next 20 minutes held. I picked up the coffee Chief Tackett had made me, and I walked toward the door, a commander who had decided that the first thing my wing would learn about me was not that I could not be crossed, but that I would rather teach than punish. A change of command is the oldest kind of theater the military has, and it works because every part of it means something. The formation stands at attention. The colors of the wing, the flag that embodies its history, are physically passed from hand to hand, and whoever holds that flag holds the unit. There is no ambiguity in it. When the colors come to you, you are the commander, and everyone standing on that ramp knows it in their bones. We held it on the flight line, in a hangar open to the morning, with the aircraft lined up behind us and the formation filling the floor. Major General Dale Crowder, the numbered Air Force commander, and a man I had known and worked for across 15 years, presided. I had served under General Crowder when I was a young major, and he knew my record the way few people did. Not the version my family told, the real one. I stood in the official party in my service dress, the eagles bright on my shoulders, and I let my eyes move once across the formation. Rows of airmen at attention, faces forward, the whole wing assembled to meet the person who would lead them. And in the second row, squared away, certain, with no idea on earth what was coming, stood Staff Sergeant Wade Brennan. He had not recognized me yet. In uniform, in the official party, framed by generals and colors. I was a different creature than the woman in the plain jacket he had waved off the evening before. He was looking at the new commander the way you look at a stranger of high rank, with respectful blankness. He did not yet know he had met me. The adjutant stepped to the microphone to read the orders. This is the legal heart of the ceremony, the moment the authority actually transfers. The hangar went still, and in the quiet, clear voice that carries across a formation, the orders were read aloud. By order of the Secretary of the Air Force, Colonel Adele Kingsley assumes command of this wing. I watched his face. I had told myself I would, and I did. I found him in the second row, and I watched the words travel into him. I watched him hear the name. I watched him place the face on the name. I watched the parking lot come back to him, the plain jacket, the woman he had told to wait outside the fence. And I watched him understand, in real time, in front of the entire wing, exactly who he had turned away. The color went out of his face. I have seen fear on a lot of faces in a lot of places, and this was the particular fear of a young person who believes in a single, sickening instant that he has ended his own career. He thought he was finished. You could see him bracing for it, standing at attention while the floor opened under him. General Crowder passed me the colors. I took the staff in both hands and felt the weight of the wings settle into my arms. The most honest piece of ground I had ever stood on finally. Fully mine. I returned the colors to the bearer and I stepped to the microphone and I said the few words a new commander says about the privilege of leading them, about the mission, about the people in those rows. And then the formal part was done, and it was time for the new commander to troop the line, to walk the formation, and meet the wing face to face. I walked the rows. I stopped and spoke to airmen here and there, the way you do. And then I came to the second row, and I stopped in front of Staff Sergeant Wade Brennan. He snapped to attention so hard I thought he might injure himself, and he brought his hand up in a salute that trembled at the very edge, and he held it, waiting for the blade to fall. He expected me to destroy him in front of everyone. He expected the public ruin he was certain he had earned. Every person nearby had heard the parking lot story by now, and they were all watching to see what the new commander would do to the man who had turned her away. I returned his salute, crisply, correctly, the way you return the salute of any troop doing his duty. And then I looked him in the eye, and I said quietly, so that only the nearest few could hear, that the line had looked well guarded yesterday evening, and that I was glad to have men on that gate who did not let strangers wander onto my flight line. That was all. No shaming, no speech. I gave him back the salute and a single sentence that turned his worst mistake into something he had done right, and I moved on down the line. General Crowder, when he addressed the assembled leadership a few minutes later, did something my own father had never done. He told them, briefly and plainly, who I was. He mentioned the Distinguished Flying Cross and the night over a country he did not name when I brought a broken aircraft and its people home. He mentioned the squadron and the group. He said the things my family had waved away for 27 years, and he said them out loud, to 1,000 airmen, as simple fact. I thought, as Crowder spoke, about how strange it was to hear my own record read aloud by someone who simply believed it. My family had been present for every milestone he listed, and had filed each one away as small. Here, in a hangar full of strangers, the same facts were spoken as plain truth and received as plain truth, and the difference was not in the facts. The difference was entirely in who was willing to see them. For 27 years I had assumed that if my own father could not see what I had done, it must not be as real as the citations claimed. Standing there, holding the colors, hearing a general say it without flinching, I understood at last that my accomplishments had always been real. The only thing that had ever been in question was the eyesight of the people I had handed them to. And somewhere in the second row, a young sergeant stood at attention with his career intact and his entire understanding of who belongs on a flight line, quietly coming apart and rebuilding itself into something better. I had Staff Sergeant Brennan report to my office that afternoon. I could see when he came through the door that he had spent the hours since the ceremony, certain that the mercy on the flight line had only been for show, that the real consequences waited for him in private. He came to attention in front of my desk, braced for the end of his career. I told him to stand at ease. Then I asked him a question he was not expecting. I asked him why he had guarded that line so hard the night before. He hesitated, and then he told me the truth, because he was an honest young man, and honest young men eventually tell you the truth. He said the flight line was where the real work happened. He said the jets did not fly themselves, that the people who kept them flying earned their place out there, and that he was not going to let some stranger who wandered up in civilian clothes treat it like a place to take pictures. He said it with conviction, and as he said it, I felt the years fold over on themselves because he was speaking, almost word for word, in my father's voice. I told him he was not wrong. That surprised him more than a punishment would have. I told him the flight line did belong to the people who kept the jets flying, that his instinct to guard it was good, that I never wanted to lose airmen who took that ground seriously. And then I told him the one thing he had missed. I told him I was one of those people. I told him I had loved flight lines since I was 12 years old, that I had spent 27 years on them, that I had flown the very aircraft parked behind the hangar where he had stood in formation that morning. I told him that the woman he had decided was a sightseer had more hours on that ramp than he had years in the Air Force. And then I told him about my father. I told him my father was a retired chief master sergeant, a crew chief with 32 years on the line, and that my father had said the exact words Brennan had just said to me, in the exact tone, my entire life. I told him that because of those words, I had spent 30 years, more than half believing I did not belong on a flight line, that I had let a good and certain man convince me I was a visitor to the one place I loved most. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was not quite steady, "I would have bet my stripes you didn't belong out there." "I know," I told him. "That is exactly why I stepped back. I have been stepping back my whole life." Yesterday was the last time. I watched him take that in. I watched him understand that the woman in the plain jacket had let him turn her away, not out of weakness and not as a trap, but because a much older man had taught her, long ago, to make room for that exact certainty. And I watched him decide, the way young people sometimes visibly decide things, that he would carry the line differently from now on. Not less seriously, differently. With a little more room in it for the possibility that the person in front of him had earned the ground too. He left my office that afternoon, standing taller than he had come in, which is the strange arithmetic of being corrected without being crushed. I had not made him smaller. I had made him larger, and he knew it, and he would remember it longer than he would have remembered any counseling statement. The story, meanwhile, had legs. Someone had recorded the ceremony, as someone always does now, and a clip of General Crowder reading my record, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the night over the country he would not name, found its way into a base community group online, and from there into the wider current. My sister Bridget saw it. I do not know exactly how it reached her, an old neighbor, a cousin, the strange way these things travel, but it reached her. For the first time in her life, my sister watched strangers describe me, not as the daughter who took the long way around to a desk, not as the one who flew the trash haulers, not as the family member with the little job no one quite understood. She watched a 2-star general stand in a hangar and describe her younger sister as a leader, a combat aviator, a person other people were proud to follow. She watched it, she told me later, more than once. I should tell you what changed for Brennan, because it is the part of command I care about most. A week after our conversation, I was walking the line at dusk, and I came across him at the same entry control point, checking in a delivery driver who had every right to be there and no idea where to go. I watched him handle it. He was just as thorough as he had been with me, just as careful about the badge and the access, the standard exactly as high. But there was something new in how he did it. He asked the driver a question instead of making an assumption. He confirmed who the man was before he decided what the man was. It is a small thing, the difference between guarding a gate and judging the person at it, and most people never learn it at all. He had learned it in a week because I had corrected him without humiliating him, and a corrected young man who still has his dignity will run through a wall for you. A humiliated one only learns to hide his mistakes. I have led long enough to know which kind of airman wins wars, and it is not the frightened one. That was the beginning of the part of this story I did not see coming, the part where the fence my father built, the one I had been standing on the wrong side of my whole life, finally quietly started to come down. In the weeks after I took command, I did the thing I had waited my whole life to do without permission. I walked my flight line every day. I learned the names of the crews and the controllers and the young troops on the gates, including the airmen who worked alongside Wade Brennan. I stood on the ramp at first light and at last light and in the rain, and not once did anyone tell me to wait in the parking lot. And slowly the strangest feeling settled into me, which was the feeling of no longer waiting for anyone to confirm that I was allowed to be there. I had stopped waiting for permission to belong. After 49 years, it turned out, that was a thing you could simply decide. My sister called me about 3 weeks into the command. The conversation was awkward in the way that real things between people who have hurt each other are always awkward. She did not deliver a grand apology. We are not, as a family, builders of grand apologies. But she asked me questions, real ones. She asked what an airlift wing actually does. She asked how many people I was responsible for, and when I told her the number, she went quiet. And then she asked me what a Distinguished Flying Cross was. I had held that medal for 17 years. My sister had been in the room the day I told the family about it, the day my father said it sounded like I had gotten lucky, and she asked if it came with a raise. 17 years, and it was the first time she had ever asked me what it actually meant. I told her. I told her about the aircraft and the people in the back and the long flight home with the controls fighting me the whole way. She listened to all of it. It was the first conversation about my career that my sister and I had ever had, in which she was actually trying to understand it instead of file it away as something small. My father was another matter. My mother told me in one of our phone calls that Russ had watched the recording of the ceremony, more than once, alone. In the garage, with the door pulled down, the way he went when he had something he did not know how to feel. He had not called me. He had said almost nothing about it to my mother. but she had heard the recording playing through the garage door in the evenings. The sound of a general reading his daughter's record, and she had left him to it, because she had been married to his certainty for 50 years, and she knew that the only way through it was to let it work on him in the dark. I want to tell you that not getting a call hurt me, and once it would have, more than I can say. But something had shifted on that flight line, and the truth is that I no longer needed the call. I had spent my whole life waiting for one particular man to walk through one particular gate and tell me I belonged. And I had finally understood that he was never going to. Not because I had not earned it, but because the gate was his, and he did not know how to open it. Realizing that I no longer needed him too was the entire point. It was the freedom I had been flying toward for 27 years without knowing its name. So I did something I had never done. I wrote my father a letter. Not a long one. We are not, as I said, a family of long letters. I told him that I had arrived at my new base a day early, and that a young sergeant had stopped me at the edge of the flight line and told me I did not belong there, and that the young sergeant had sounded exactly like him. I told him that for the first time I had not been angry about it, because I had finally understood why he had loved that ground so fiercely and guarded it so jealously, and that I loved it the same way, and that I thought, in the end, he had taught me that even when he was trying to keep me off it. I told him the line looked well guarded the day I came. I did not ask him for anything. I did not ask him to call. I put the letter in the mail, and then I did the hardest thing, which was to let it go and not wait by the phone. My mother and I talked more in those weeks than we had in years, and in those conversations, I finally learned about the folder. She had kept it since I was a girl, she told me, a plain manila folder that lived in the bottom drawer of her sewing table. The scholarship notice she had clipped the week I announced ROTC, the program from my winging, a grainy newspaper photograph of me beside an aircraft after my first deployment, the citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, which she had asked me to mail her 17 years ago, and which I had assumed she filed and forgot. Every promotion order, she had said almost nothing across all those years, had sat silent at all those dinners while my father held court and my sister laughed along, and the whole time she had been quietly building a record of a daughter she believed in and did not know how to defend out loud. She told me she had stayed quiet because she did not have the words to stand up to 50 years of my father's certainty, and that her silence had been its own kind of failure, and she was sorry for it. I told her the folder said everything her voice could not, and that I forgave her, and I meant it. A quiet ally is still an ally. Sometimes the person keeping the record is the only reason you survive long enough to be seen. I had a wing to run. I ran it, and somewhere across an ocean, an old crew chief sat in a closed garage and watched his daughter take command of everything he had spent his life believing she could only visit, and I left the question of what he would do about it open, the way you leave a hangar door open at dawn, not knowing yet what is going to taxi out. The reply came about a month later, and it did not come as a phone call or a letter. It came as a package. It was small and heavy, and wrapped in brown paper in my father's careful block printing, and when I opened it on my desk at Ramstein, I had to sit down. Inside, wrapped in an old red shop rag, was his torque wrench, the torque wrench. The one from the garage in 1994, the one he had put my 17-year-old hands around and taught me to feel for the click. He had carried it for 32 years on the line and kept it for 24 more in retirement, and now he had boxed it up and sent it across an ocean to me. There was a note, 4 words, in the same block printing. Your line now. Keep it honest. That was all. From another man, it would have been almost nothing. From my father, it was everything he had. He could not write that he was proud of me. The words were not in him. 50 years of certainty had not left room for them. But he took the one object he had ever called honest, the tool that meant the work, the ground, the whole creed he had built his life on, and he put it in my hands and told me the line was mine now. He could not say he was proud. So he sent me a salute in the only language he had ever trusted, and from my father, that torque wrench was a 21-gun salute. I keep it on my desk. Every airman who comes into my office sees it, and most of them have no idea what it is. I know exactly what it is. It is my father, finally, opening the gate. Bridget came to visit Ramstein a few months later. She stood at the edge of the ramp on a bright afternoon behind the line, and she watched me see an aircraft off. She watched the crews work and the big jet taxi out and lift into the sky, and when I walked back to her, she had a look on her face I had never seen her wear about me. She had spent her whole life agreeing with our father about what I was, and standing there at the edge of my flight line, she finally saw what he had seen out there all those years and what I had become inside it. She did not say much. She did not have to. My sister, who had called me the family's consolation prize, stood at the edge of my flight line and was proud of me and let me see it. And here's the part I did not arrange and could not have, the part that still makes me smile. When Bridget came onto the base that day, the young airman who checked her in at the flight line, who confirmed her badge and walked her out to the right spot to watch, was Staff Sergeant Wade Brennan. The same sergeant who had blocked me at that gate now held it open for my sister. Carefully, correctly, with exactly the right amount of room in it for the possibility that the person in front of him belonged. The gate that had closed on me opened for my family in the hands of the very man who had once shut it. I do not believe in tidy endings, but I believe in that one because I watched it happen. I called my father, finally, after the wrench arrived. It was a short call, because all of ours are. I did not make him say the words he could not say, and he did not try to say them, and somehow that made the call easier rather than harder. We talked about the aircraft I command now, and he asked about the maintenance program, and the readiness rates, and the young crew chiefs, and for the first time in my life, his questions about the people who keep the jets flying did not feel like a way of looking past me. They felt like a man trying to talk to his daughter in the only vocabulary the two of them had ever truly shared. Halfway through, he asked me whether the troops on my gates were any good, and I told him about Brennan, the whole story, the parking lot, and the salute, and the week later at the gate. My father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the young man had done right to guard the line hard, and that I had done right to teach him soft, and that maybe both of those things had always been true at the same time. From my father, that was practically a sermon. I think it was the closest he could come to saying that he had been the sergeant once, certain and wrong at the same gate, and that he knew it now. So let me tell you what I learned at the edge of a flight line 8,000 kilometers from the garage where it started, the thing I had needed 49 years and a young sergeant's crossed arms to finally understand. The people who tell you that you do not belong are almost always guarding a gate they believe is theirs. Sometimes it is a stranger in a uniform. Sometimes it is the person who raised you and loved you and taught you to love the very thing they are keeping you from. They are not always cruel. Often they are simply certain, and certainty is a fence that looks exactly like the truth from the inside. You do not have to tear the fence down. You do not have to make anyone small to get through it. You only have to stop waiting for permission to walk onto ground you have already earned. The quietest and most complete kind of revenge is not making them admit they were wrong. It is simply standing where they said you could not stand, at peace, as yourself, and discovering that you were always allowed to be there. I stood on my flight line at dawn this morning, before the formation, before the noise, the rising sun coming up gold over the aircraft the way it came up over a strip of concrete when I was 12 years old. There was no one to ask. There was no gate to clear. There was only the honest ground my father loved, and me, his daughter, finally home on it. Keep it honest. I will. If you have ever loved something your whole life and still been made to feel like a visitor to it, I would love to hear your story in the comments. Did someone in your own family teach you to stand on the wrong side of a fence you had every right to walk through? Did you ever finally decide to stop waiting for permission to belong, and what did that feel like the morning you did? And if you were me, standing in front of that young sergeant as the orders were read, do you think you could have returned his salute instead of breaking him with it? I read every comment, and the ones from people who have stood quietly in their own truth mean the most to me. If this story reached something in you, hit subscribe and stay a while. The honest ground is big enough for all of us.